Arielle Jackson stared at the message on her phone for the third time that night, certain her eyes were playing tricks on her. Do not answer your door tomorrow. Destroy the silver flash drive before sunrise. Trust no one. She almost laughed. Almost. Because 48 hours ago, laughter had come easily to her. She had been 3 months from her wedding day, dressed in white lace at a bridal shower surrounded by women who loved her, sipping champagne she didn't even like, because it felt like the kind of thing brides were supposed to do. Now she sat alone in the dark, her phone the only light in an apartment that no longer felt like home, wondering who would send a stranger these words and why they had chosen her. She typed back one furious sentence: "Leave me alone." The reply came seconds later, and this time her fingers went cold around the phone. "You're already involved." Before she could process what that meant, before she could even set the phone down, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone testing the handle of her apartment door. Not knocking, testing, like they already believed they had the right to come in. If you're new here, welcome. Stories like Arielle's are exactly what this channel was built for, so make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next changes everything she thought she knew about her own life. 3 days earlier, Arielle Jackson had been the kind of woman other people admired without knowing the cost of that admiration. At 30 years old, she had built a reputation as one of the sharpest financial investigators in her firm, the person clients requested by name when something didn't add up in the numbers. She had a gift for finding what others tried to hide, though she never once imagined that gift would eventually turn on the people closest to her. She had spent her 20s being the dependable one. When her mother's medical bills piled up faster than insurance could cover them, Arielle quietly drained her savings and never mentioned it at family dinners. When her aunt passed away and left behind a grieving teenage daughter, Arielle opened her home and raised her younger cousin, Destiny, as if she were her own sister. She skipped 2 promotions so she could keep an eye on Destiny through high school. She never asked for thanks. She simply believed that love meant showing up, even when it cost you something. And for a long time, it seemed to be working. She had a career she was proud of, a mother who was healthy again, a cousin who called her practically her best friend, and a fiancé, Marcus, who told her every single day that he didn't know how he'd gotten so lucky. She should have asked herself why a man who never had to try that hard to win her kept trying so hard to keep her. On the morning of her bridal shower, 3 months before the wedding, Arielle woke up early to review her accounts before the celebrations began, a habit she'd never been able to shake. What she found made her blood run cold. Nearly all of her savings, the money she'd built over a decade of discipline and sacrifice, had been transferred out in small increments over the past year, routed through shell companies she'd never heard of, authorized with digital signatures that looked exactly like hers but weren't. She sat frozen at her kitchen table for almost 20 minutes before she understood the second, more devastating truth. The transfers required someone with intimate access to her devices, her passwords, her daily patterns, someone she trusted enough to never think twice about. She found the messages on Marcus's laptop that same afternoon while he was out running errands. Not just proof of the theft, but proof of an affair that had been going on for over a year. And when she scrolled far enough to see the name saved in his contacts, her stomach dropped somewhere she didn't think it could reach. Destiny, the cousin she'd raised, the girl she had tucked in during thunderstorms and paid tuition for without being asked. The one person Arielle believed would never, under any circumstance, hurt her like this. By evening, it had gotten worse. Someone, she still didn't know who, had leaked private videos and doctored screenshots across social media, painting Arielle as a manipulative, unstable woman who had driven her own fiancé away. The wedding, of course, was cancelled. Her clients began quietly distancing themselves. Her mother cried on the phone, more from confusion than anger, unable to understand how her daughter's perfect life had collapsed in a single day. Arielle didn't cry, not at first. She sat very still in her apartment that night, replaying every conversation, every late meeting Marcus claimed to have, every excuse Destiny made for missing family functions, searching for the moment she should have seen it coming. She found nothing. That was the part that frightened her most. She was a woman trained to spot deception for a living, and she hadn't seen it happening in her own home. That was the night the first text arrived. Do not answer your door tomorrow. Destroy the silver flash drive before sunrise. Trust no one. She had no idea what silver flash drive they meant. She owned nothing like that, which was exactly why she assumed it was some cruel prank timed by someone who knew her life was already falling apart and wanted to twist the knife further. "Leave me alone," she typed. "You're already involved," came the reply, and then someone tried her door handle. Arielle didn't scream. She backed away from the door slowly, phone gripped so tightly her knuckles ached, and watched the handle turn once, twice, testing the lock. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Footsteps retreated down the hallway. She stood there for nearly an hour before she trusted her legs enough to move. She didn't sleep that night. She sat on her couch with a kitchen knife in her lap, feeling foolish and terrified in equal measure, watching the door as if it might open on its own. By morning, the fear had curdled into something else, a strange, watchful numbness. She looked out her window and saw two black SUVs parked across the street, engines idling, windows tinted too dark to see inside. She told herself it was a coincidence. Businessmen, a film shoot, anything but what her instincts were screaming at her. Marcus called 4 times before 9 a.m. She let it go to voicemail each time, until the 5th call, when she finally picked up out of pure exhaustion. "Arielle, listen to me," he said, his voice tight in a way she'd never heard before. "I need your phone. Just bring it to me or let me come get it. Please, this isn't about us anymore." "There is no us," she said, and hung up. Destiny texted 20 minutes later. "Please, we need to talk. It's not what you think. You're in danger, and I can explain everything if you just let me." Arielle didn't respond to either of them. Instead, she stood at her window, watching the SUVs, and for the first time allowed herself to consider a terrifying possibility, that the message she'd dismissed as a scam might have been the only honest thing anyone had told her in weeks. The waiting was its own kind of torment. Arielle had always been a woman who solved problems by working them, by laying out every variable until a pattern emerged, but there was no pattern here she could find. She tried calling her mother, if only to hear a voice that hadn't lied to her, but stopped herself halfway through dialing, terrified of dragging her into whatever this was. She tried calling the police once, got as far as describing a strange text message and 2 parked vehicles, and heard the bored disinterest in the dispatcher's voice before she'd even finished the sentence. There was nothing illegal about parked cars. There was nothing illegal about a text message. She hung up before she could explain herself into sounding as unstable as the internet already believed she was. Around noon, one of the men from the SUVs crossed the street and stood beneath her window for nearly 10 minutes, not hiding, not pretending to be anything other than what he was, a message delivered through presence alone. Arielle stepped back from the glass, heart hammering, and for the first time allowed herself to consider that she might not survive whatever was coming for her, not because she was reckless, but because she had no idea what game she was even playing. She was still standing there when the lead SUV's door opened. The man who stepped out moved like he owned the ground beneath him. Tall, composed, dressed in a black suit tailored so precisely it looked less like fashion and more like armor. Even from 3 floors up, Arielle could feel the shift in the air around him, the way the 2 men flanking him adjusted their posture without being told, the way pedestrians on the sidewalk instinctively gave him space. He looked up directly at her window as if he'd known exactly where to find her. 10 minutes later, he was standing in her doorway. "My name is Baek Si-woo," he said, his voice calm in a way that made the words feel heavier, not lighter. "The people hunting you believe you possess something that belongs to me." Arielle stared at him, at the tattoos just visible beneath his shirt cuffs, at the scar along his jaw that told its own quiet story, and felt something in her chest go very still. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "I don't have anything. I don't even know who you are." "I believe you," he said, which surprised her more than anything else he could have said. "That is what makes this dangerous. You are caught in something you never agreed to be part of, and by tomorrow, the people responsible for your fiancé's betrayal will stop trying to manipulate you and start trying to eliminate you." "My fiancé," she stopped herself. "How do you know about that?" "Because none of it was an accident," Baek Si-woo said. "Not the affair, not the theft. Not the rumors that destroyed your reputation. Every piece of your suffering this past week was designed, Miss Jackson, to break you down slowly enough that you would hand over what you don't even know you have. Before this goes any further, if you want to see how deep this conspiracy really runs, stay with me, because what Arielle discovers next rewrites everything she believed about her own father." Arielle wanted to slam the door in his face and call the police. She almost did. But something about the certainty in his eyes, the way he spoke about her stolen money and her fiancé's betrayal like he'd read the police report himself, kept her rooted in place. You have 5 minutes to convince me you're not insane, she said. I don't need 5 minutes, Baek Si-woo replied. I need 30 seconds and I need you to look outside. She did. 2 more vehicles had arrived down the block, unmarked, engines off, doors already opening. Men in dark clothing moved with the unhurried efficiency of people who had done this before, spreading out along the perimeter of her building like a net slowly drawing closed. Those men are not police, Baek Si-woo said quietly, and they are not here to ask you questions. Arielle's hands were shaking, though her voice, when she finally spoke, came out steadier than she expected. What do they want? A flash drive your father hid before he died. Silver, small enough to fit in your palm. He built encryption into it that only your biometric signature can unlock, which means as long as you're alive, you're the only key that exists. He paused. Which is also the only reason you're still alive. My father died in a car accident, Arielle said. 6 years ago. Your father, Baek Si-woo said, was murdered because he uncovered a criminal network powerful enough to buy silence from corporations, from politicians, and from people who were supposed to protect this city. I have spent years trying to prove it. I believe you have spent your entire life not knowing it. Floor of Arielle's understanding cracked open beneath her, and for one disorienting moment, every memory of her father, the late nights at his desk, the locked drawer he never let her touch, the strange caution he taught her about trusting people too quickly, rearranged itself into a shape she had never let herself see. Downstairs, glass shattered. We don't have time for you to decide whether to believe me, Baek Si-woo said, already pulling her toward the fire stairs. We only have time for you to decide whether you want to survive the next 10 minutes. She went with him, not because she trusted him, because for the first time in a week, someone was finally telling her something that made sense. They moved down 3 flights of stairs, while the sound of forced entry echoed above them, men's voices shouting in a language Arielle didn't recognize, boots pounding against tile. Baek Si-woo kept one hand near his jacket, the other steady against her back, getting her without ever once pushing her faster than her legs could manage, which she would later realize was its own kind of control, the discipline of a man who had done this before and refused to let panic dictate his movements. They reached the parking garage just as 2 men rounded the corner ahead of them, weapons already raised. What happened next took less than 15 seconds, though Arielle would replay it in her mind for weeks afterward. Baek Si-woo moved between her and the threat with a speed that didn't match his calm exterior, disarming the first man before he could fire, using the second man's own momentum to put him on the ground. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was efficient, almost bored, the way a man moves through a task he's mastered so completely it no longer requires his full attention. In the car, he said, and this time Arielle didn't argue. They drove in silence for the first 10 minutes, weaving through traffic with a precision that suggested Baek Si-woo had planned this route long before he ever knocked on her door. Arielle sat with her hands clenched in her lap, trying to steady her breathing, trying to make sense of a world that had rearranged itself twice in 1 week. Tell me about my father, she finally said. Baek Si-woo's jaw tightened, the first genuine crack she'd seen in his composure. Your father spent the final 2 years of his life investigating a network that moves money for organized crime through legitimate corporations, my former organization among them, and the rival faction that destroyed my family alongside it. He found evidence connecting corrupt officials, falsified contracts, and a decade of laundered assets. Before anyone could silence him, he hid that evidence somewhere only you could retrieve it. Me, because he trusted you more than anyone else alive, Baek Si-woo said, and because he believed, correctly, that no one would think to look at his daughter. Arielle looked down at her hands, remembering her father's insistence, years ago, on a strange biometric lock system for his home office that she'd always assumed was paranoia. She remembered the drawer he never explained. She remembered him saying, days before the accident that took his life, if anything ever happens to me, trust your instincts before you trust anyone's words. She hadn't understood it then. She understood it now, and it terrified her. Organization responsible for his death, she said slowly, is the same one that destroyed your family? Yes, Baek Si-woo said. My father built something meant to protect people who had no one else to protect them. A rival faction wanted his territory and his silence. They took both the night they killed him, and they've spent the years since expanding into legitimate industries where no one thinks to look for blood money. His eyes met hers in the mirror. I am not looking for profit, Miss Jackson. I am looking for the only evidence that can dismantle them permanently. If this story has you on the edge of your seat already, don't forget to like this video. It helps more people find stories like Arielle's, and trust me, the next twist changes everything you think you understand about her fiancé. They spent the following days moving between safe houses Baek Si-woo's organization maintained across the city, a penthouse with blacked-out windows, an underground financial vault disguised as a storage facility, a mountain compound 2 hours outside the city where the air felt clean enough to almost make Arielle forget why she was there. It was in that mountain compound, on the third night, that Arielle finally allowed herself to ask the question that had been circling her mind since the moment Marcus's betrayal came to light. Was any of it real? She asked, staring into the fire Baek Si-woo had built without being asked. My relationship with Marcus, any of it? Baek Si-woo was quiet for a long moment. I had my people look into his history the moment I identified you as a target. Marcus was recruited 3 years before he ever approached you at that coffee shop you always mention when you talk about how you two met. He was chosen specifically because of your father's case, positioned to gain your trust slowly enough that you'd never suspect it was calculated. Destiny, your cousin, was recruited more recently, financially pressured into cooperating after gambling debts she couldn't repay. I don't say this to excuse what she did. I say it because you deserve to understand the shape of what happened to you, even the parts that will hurt. Arielle sat with that for a long time, watching the fire, feeling something inside her shift from grief into something colder and more focused. So the whole relationship, the wedding, the future I thought I was building, it was never mine. It belonged to whoever was pulling the strings. It was theirs, Baek Si-woo agreed. But what you build from here forward belongs entirely to you. She looked at him then, really looked, and saw not the feared Mafia boss the world outside knew him as, but a man who had spent years carrying the same kind of grief she was only beginning to understand, the grief of losing someone to violence disguised as accident, of inheriting a war he never asked for. Your father, she said quietly. Tell me what happened to him. Baek Si-woo's expression didn't change, but something in his voice did. He was killed in front of me when I was 19. Shot twice in an office he believed was secure, by men working for the same organization now hunting you. I spent the next decade rebuilding what he left behind, not because I wanted his throne, but because I refused to let his death mean nothing. That's not so different from me spending my whole life taking care of everyone else, because I refused to let my mother's illness or my aunt's death mean nothing, Arielle said. For the first time since they'd met, Baek Si-woo almost smiled. No, it isn't. Something shifted between them that night, not dramatic, not immediate, but real. The quiet recognition of two people who had built their entire identities around carrying other people's pain, and were only now beginning to imagine what it might feel like to set some of it down. In the days that followed, that shift deepened in small, unspoken ways. Baek Si-woo began making Arielle's coffee the way she liked it without being asked twice, having noticed on the first morning that she took it black with a single spoon of sugar, never more, never less. Arielle, in turn, learned to read the tightness in his shoulders that meant a difficult phone call was coming before he ever announced it, and would quietly leave a cup of tea beside him without comment. Neither of them named what was happening. Both of them noticed it anyway. One evening, working late over her father's files, Arielle found a photograph tucked among the encrypted documents. Her father, younger than she'd ever known him, standing beside a man she didn't recognize outside a building she didn't know. When she showed it to Baek Si-woo, his expression changed in a way she hadn't seen before, something between grief and recognition. That's my father, he said quietly. They knew each other. It turned out her father hadn't stumbled onto the conspiracy by accident at all. He had been introduced to it through a cautious, years-long correspondence with Baek Si-woo's father, two men on opposite sides of the world who had independently arrived at the same dangerous truth and had begun, carefully, to trust each other with it before both were silenced within 18 months of each other. They were building something together, Arielle said, staring at the photograph. And neither of us knew. Maybe that's why this feels less like coincidence and more like inheritance, Baek Si-woo said. Arielle looked up at him, and for a moment neither of them looked away. My father used to tell me that trust was the most expensive thing you could give someone, because once it was spent, you couldn't always get it back. She paused. I think I understand now why he was so careful with it. Yet you're still here, Baek Si-woo said. Still choosing to give it, Even after everyone who was supposed to earn it took it from you instead. Maybe I'm just better at choosing who deserves it now, Arielle said, and the quiet that followed said more than either of them was ready to put into words. Over the following days, Arielle learned to read the encrypted files her father left behind, piece by piece, with Baek Si-woo's technical team working alongside her. The deeper they dug, the more the conspiracy revealed itself. Falsified contracts worth hundreds of millions, a network of shell companies stretching across 3 continents, and financial trails leading directly to men both Arielle and Baek Si-woo had once trusted. It was Baek Si-woo's own second-in-command, a man named Hyun-yi who had served him for nearly 8 years, who orchestrated the safe house attack that came on the 7th night. Arielle woke to the sound of gunfire and Baek Si-woo's hand pulling her from bed before her mind fully registered what was happening. The compound's defenses, meant to hold against any outside threat, had been disabled from within. By the time they reached the lower level, the flash drive, the one piece of physical evidence they'd been protecting above all else, was gone, and so was Hyun-yi. "He's been with you for 8 years, Arielle said, breathless, as they fled through a service tunnel Baek Si-woo hadn't wanted to use unless absolutely necessary. "How long has he been working against you? Long enough that I should have seen it," Baek Si-woo said, his voice tight with a fury Arielle hadn't heard from him before. "He was there the night my father died. I always assumed grief made him loyal to me. I never considered it made him useful to them instead." They made it 3 blocks before Arielle was separated from him in the chaos of the extraction, grabbed from behind and forced into an unmarked van before she could even scream his name. She woke in a windowless room, wrists bound, facing a man she'd never seen before but somehow already understood, silver-haired, expensively dressed, with the calm cruelty of someone who had spent decades getting exactly what he wanted. "Miss Jackson," he said, "my name isn't important. What is important is that you understand the position you're in. Your father's evidence would have destroyed 30 years of careful work. We intend to finish what your engagement to Marcus started 3 years ago, using your identity and now your biometric access to complete one final transaction before we erase every trace of this organization's existence." "You need me alive," Arielle said, forcing steel into her voice despite the fear clawing at her chest. "For now," he agreed. "Which means you have more leverage than you realize if you're smart enough to use it." He left her alone after that, locking the door behind him, and Arielle spent the next several hours doing the only thing she knew how to do when the world around her refused to make sense. She worked the problem. She catalogued every sound that reached her through the walls, the rhythm of footsteps changing shift every 4 hours, the faint hum of a generator that told her the room she was in wasn't part of the main structure, but some kind of annex, likely older, likely with wiring that hadn't been updated in decades. She thought of her father, of the caution he'd tried to teach her without ever fully explaining why, and understood, perhaps for the first time, that he had been preparing her for exactly this without either of them knowing it. When the silver-haired man returned, he brought with him a laptop and a tone considerably less patient than before. "Time is a luxury neither of us has anymore, Miss Jackson. My associates want this transaction completed within 48 hours, and I would prefer not to explain to them why their key remains uncooperative." "Your associates," Arielle repeated, "the same ones who killed my father, who orchestrated my engagement, who bankrupted a grieving 19-year-old girl into betraying her own cousin." She let the words sit, watching his expression for the flicker of discomfort she was hoping to find. "You keep calling this a transaction like it's clean. Like there isn't a decade of bodies underneath it. Sentiment won't save you," he said, though something in his voice had thinned. "No," Arielle agreed, "but information might save you if this falls apart the way I think it's about to. So let's talk about what happens to men like you when the people you answer to decide you're a liability instead of an asset." It was a bluff built on nothing but instinct and the anxious tremor she'd noticed in his hands from the very beginning, but it landed exactly where she needed it to. He hesitated, just long enough, and in that hesitation, Arielle finished what she'd started with the security panel 2 hours earlier. "Don't go anywhere. The next few minutes are exactly why this story has kept viewers glued to their screens until the very end, because Arielle is about to prove she was never the victim they thought she was." Arielle had spent 30 years being underestimated by people who mistook her patience for weakness. She had watched her fiancé lie to her face for a year without flinching, watched her cousin betray her while calling her family, and survived every version of manipulation this conspiracy had thrown at her. She was done being anyone's pawn. She studied her captor for a long moment, cataloging every detail her training as a financial investigator had taught her to notice: the slight tremor in his left hand, the way his eyes flicked toward the door whenever footsteps passed outside, the anxious rhythm of a man running out of time and trying not to show it. "You need this transaction completed before someone else finds what my father hid," she said slowly, "which means you're more exposed right now than you've ever been. Whatever plan you had is falling apart faster than you're willing to admit." His jaw tightened, confirming what she suspected. "You're clever. That's exactly what worries me about letting you live longer than necessary." "Then let me make this simple," Arielle said. "I unlock the files, you get your money. And in exchange, you tell me everything, including who really killed my father and who's been managing Marcus and Destiny this entire time." It was a gamble, offering cooperation she never intended to give, but she needed information and she needed time. Baek Si-woo had taught her, in the handful of days they'd spent together, that patience paired with intelligence was more dangerous than any weapon. She got both. While the guard's attention drifted, distracted by her calm, reasonable negotiating, Arielle noticed the outdated security panel by the door, a model she recognized from her investigative work years earlier, one with a well-known vulnerability in its wiring. It took her less than 90 seconds, working with hands still partially bound, to short the circuit and kill the lock. She was 3 hallways into her escape when Baek Si-woo found her, his men fanning out behind him, relief and something rawer flickering across his face before his composure reasserted itself. "You didn't wait for us," he said. "I didn't need to," Arielle replied, and for the first time since her world collapsed, she felt something close to pride. Together, they used the information Arielle had gathered, fragments about shipping schedules, half-mentioned names, the anxious tale of a man running out of time, to trace the conspiracy back to its source. A man named Richard Voss, a corporate executive whose legitimate business empire had spent 30 years laundering blood money for both Baek Si-woo's rival faction and the men who had killed Arielle's father. Voss had orchestrated everything: the recruitment of Marcus, the manipulation of Destiny's debts, even Hyunyi's betrayal within Baek Si-woo's own organization, all in service of one final transaction that would move billions beyond the reach of any investigation, permanently and untraceably. The final confrontation happened not with violence, but with exposure. Arielle spent 2 days working alongside Baek Si-woo's financial team, translating her father's encrypted evidence into documentation clean enough to hand directly to international regulators, journalists, and the few honest officials Baek Si-woo had spent years quietly cultivating. When the story broke, it broke everywhere at once, too widespread and too well-documented for Voss's remaining allies to bury it in time. Richard Voss was arrested attempting to flee the country 3 days later. Hyunyi was found by Baek Si-woo's remaining loyal men before he ever reached the safety he'd been promised. Marcus and Destiny, both of whom had cooperated with investigators once the conspiracy above them collapsed, faced charges of their own: fraud, conspiracy, and financial crimes serious enough to end whatever future either of them had imagined for themselves. Arielle testified in a courtroom 3 months later, her voice steady in a way it hadn't been since the morning she found her savings gone. She watched her former fiancé refuse to meet her eyes, watched her cousin cry without ever quite managing an apology that meant anything, and felt, for the first time in a long time, entirely at peace with letting both of them go. Her name was cleared publicly and completely. The videos and rumors that had once painted her as unstable were replaced by a different story: the truth, that she had survived a conspiracy powerful enough to destroy governments, and done it not through luck, but through her own intelligence and refusal to be broken. If Arielle's strength has inspired you the way it inspired everyone following this story, make sure you're subscribed for more, because the ending you're about to see is the reward for staying until now. 6 months later, Arielle stood on the balcony of a home that finally felt like her own, watching the sun set over a city that no longer felt like a place where danger waited around every corner. She had rebuilt her career from the ground up, this time on terms she chose herself, taking only clients whose work she believed in. Baek Si-woo had spent those same months quietly dismantling what remained of the criminal infrastructure he'd inherited, redirecting his organization's resources toward the legitimate ventures his father had always intended before violence rewrote his family's future. He wasn't a man who could erase his past entirely, but he was, for the first time in over a decade, building toward something instead of simply surviving it. He found her on the balcony that evening, 2 glasses of wine in hand, and for a long moment they simply stood together in comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who have already survived the worst version of each other's company. "I keep thinking about that first text," Arielle said eventually, "the one I almost deleted without a second thought. What about it? I spent so long assuming the worst things in my life were accidents I didn't see coming," she said. "But that text wasn't an accident. It was the first honest thing anyone told me in weeks." Baek Si-woo studied her for a moment, something softer than she was used to seeing settling into his expression. "Would you have believed me that first day if I'd told you where this would end?" "No," Arielle admitted. "I would have thought you were insane." Now she smiled, setting her glass down, letting herself lean into a piece she'd spent her entire life too busy taking care of others to imagine for herself. "Now I think it's the only thing that's ever made sense." Later that night, long after the city lights had settled into their familiar glow, Arielle's phone buzzed once on the nightstand. She almost didn't check it, old instinct flaring for half a second before she remembered she had nothing left to fear. "This one was meant for you." She looked up, already knowing before she saw him standing in the doorway, phone in hand, the faintest trace of a smile on a face the world believed incapable of gentleness. She didn't reply with fear this time. She replied with a smile of her own, set the phone down, and let herself believe, finally, in an ending she had chosen. If you made it this far, thank you for staying until the end. Let me know in the comments what part of Arielle's story hit you the hardest. And don't forget to subscribe for the next story just like this one.